Good morning, everyone.
Hi, guys.
How are we all doing today? Oh wait, was that an anatomy and physiology teacher?
Yes, it was.
All right. Anyway, bye, sweetheart. I'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later.
All right. Um, this is our last Ed puzzle. We're ending the Cold War, Part 5, Decolonization and the Global Cold War. We're going to be talking about how the world became great. Well, why explain now? Let's go into it. Now, what I was going to say is during the 19th century, we talked about this, how European countries rushed to control colonies and create great empires. This is the concept of imperialism, one of the causes of the First World War. Now, after World War II, there would be a reversal of this trend called decolonization. Now, most went smoothly with orderly transitions and little violence, so this is a good thing. Some European powers were determined to preserve colonial rule, causing long and bloody struggles for independence. Now, after gaining their independence, both the US and the Soviet Union struggled to get influence over the country. You're going to see both sides trying to pull them toward each other. It's like the two older brothers who are always trying to get the youngest brother to join them. So both sides are going to try to entice them, and, oh, come join my side. So when they gain their independence, they're going to be influenced and, struggle to get influence over these countries, as both the US, the West, and the East will try to get them to join their team. Now, the cause of these colonies wanting independence was a desire for national self-determination. Ironically, this was one of Wilson's 14 points at Versailles. President Wilson was determined that every country should have national self-determination. That is, every country, the people of a country, should be able to decide what happens in their own country. Self-determination. Now, after World War II, Western Europe was economically devastated and militarily weak. This we've already discussed. So they are in poor condition to maintain control over colonies. Most wanted to avoid bloody colonial wars and focus on rebuilding their own countries. So you're not going to see a real push to hold on to these countries for the most part. Also, the moral and racial superiority they felt over the peoples of the Third World that existed before World War I had kind of disappeared in the horrors of war and the horrors of World War II. The Soviets and later the Communist Chinese supported communist independence movements with economic and military aid. The rebel insurgents, armed with Soviet-made AK-47 machine guns, became the symbol of Marxist revolution. All right, it becomes the symbol, it still is today, the weapon of choice among revolutionaries. Now, Western Europe and the US offered a competing vision of independence based on free market economics and liberal democracy. However, the US would support authoritarian regimes as long as they were anti-communist. That was the big thing. The United States, Western Europe offered economic and military aid to decolonizing nations as a way to entice them to join the West. Now, many new post-colonial leaders in these new countries preferred not to align to either side and adopted a policy of non-alignment. That's important, non-alignment. They will keep friends with both sides. Some, like Nasser in Egypt, will play one off against the other, very smartly on his part. They want to remain neutral in the Cold War, not take any one side. Now, we're going to first talk about the struggle for power in Asia. And the Dutch East Indies is where it all really, decolonization begins. Now, the Dutch had controlled Indonesia since the 17th century, way back in the time, when America was still colonies. The Dutch had controlled the East Indies. They sold us tea, if you remember, as opposed to the British tea that came from India. So it was, the Dutch had been there for a long time. Now, the first fight for independence after World War II was in the Dutch East Indies. The colonies of the Netherlands were taken over by Japan during World War II. This was the idea they needed those supplies, oil, rubber, things that were in the Dutch East Indies. Now, after Japan's defeat, the Dutch expected to return and resume control. But in 1945, Muslim rebels who embraced Marxism started a 4-year guerrilla war to gain independence. Excuse me, mouth was getting dry. In 1949, the Dutch gave up and Indonesia gained their independence, and they are an independent nation today. The new leaders followed non-alignment, and they received aid from the U.S. and from the Soviets. So they didn't take each side. Both sides promised to give them stuff, and they agreed. They took it. But they didn't actually join one side or the other side. Now, French Indochina, that's going to have long-reaching implications. Indochina was a French colony since 1887. In 1941, during World War II, Japan took control of French Indochina. They had been being controlled by the Vichy French at the time. Germany had already conquered France. Now, as I mentioned here, Japan had taken over the French colony of Indochina in 1941. Now, after Japan's defeat, France wanted to reestablish colonial rule over their colony. This is one of their prosperous colonies. They wanted to take them back under their control. However, in 1945, a communist leader named Ho Chi Minh starts a civil war to overthrow the French, to get the French out. In 1954, the French army is finally defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the French would ask the United States for help, and we didn't help them. They were not happy about that. They leave Indochina. They do warn the United States, don't go there. We didn't listen. Here we see the victory at Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese soldiers holding up their flag over the French bunker. There's actually a monument in the city of Hanoi today commemorating their victory at Dien Bien Phu. Now, French Indochina was divided into 3 countries. We have Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, this is the beginning of the end of France's colonies. So let's talk more about Vietnam. Vietnam is further divided into North and South. North has a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. Capital of the North is Hanoi. South has a republic led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Pro-communist forces in the South, they were known as the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists. They start working to overthrow the South Vietnam government. Later on, the United States will get involved by helping them, and you know where that's going to lead to. So that's where Vietnam starts. Now I'm going to talk about British India. India has been a colony of the Britain since 1793. It was run by the East India Company. They were selling tea. If you remember, they got the monopoly. They were going broke in the 1770s. They were going broke, and they got a monopoly to be the only one to sell tea in the United States in the colonies, which led to a little incident known as the Boston Tea Party. But they did control India. Now, it becomes known as the Raj in 1858. That's British-controlled India, ruled by the Crown. India is Britain's oldest, largest, and most lucrative colony in her empire. Here are some photographs just showing the wealthy people of India in Calcutta, in New Delhi, in Bombay, with their Indian servants. And it was like a culture. The British living in India becomes like a separate, almost a separate culture. Here we see a map of British India. It's much larger than actual India is, because it will eventually become 4, today 5 countries. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, after World War I, nationalists opposed to British rule followed the leadership of Mohandas Gandhi. He was born in 1869 and would die in 1948. We'll talk about that in a minute too. He was sometimes called Mahatma, or the Great Souled. Through the 20s and the 30s, Gandhi preached nonviolent, non-cooperation with British colonial rule. There was going to be no violence. They just were not going to do what they were told to do. Now, Britain responded with military violence, even massacres. The Armistice massacre in 1919 resulted in the death of over 1,000 men, women, and children by British soldiers. It was brutal. They basically marched into a courtyard that had a large group of a couple thousand Indians gathering and just started shooting at them and didn't stop basically till they ran out of bullets. This was the event that's going to push India toward its independence. Now, World War II interrupts the process of Indian self-rule. Colonial Indian soldiers fought with the British against Nazi Germany. Here they are with King George VI. But after World War II, the Labour Party comes to power, and they want to give independence to India. It's really becoming too expensive, and a lot of them have been looking to get rid, or not get rid of, but to give India its independence so they don't have to keep paying for things. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, wanted to grant independence. Not everyone in England was favor of that. Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister, wanted to keep the empire intact. Now, in 1947, Britain basically withdrew peacefully. There's a great scene in the movie Gandhi where the British are meeting with Gandhi and they basically say to him, what do you expect us to do, just to leave? And Gandhi says, yes, you're just going to one day leave. And that's exactly what happened. Peacefully, they shook hands and left. Now, India had a Hindu majority and a Muslim minority. Now, the Muslim Indians felt that they would be dominated by Hindu rule, and they wanted their own country. And before the British left, they agreed to a partition, with the border territories becoming Pakistan on either side. Later on, eastern Pakistan would become the country of Bangladesh. So we see on either side in light green would be Pakistan, and in the center in peach colored would be India. Now, Gandhi was against it, but, it was going to happen. The British were going to do it. 10 million refugees, Hindi and Muslim, fled both ways. And there was lots of violence on both sides, and they estimated that up to 1 million people lost their lives. There's a scene about this also in the movie Gandhi. Now, in 1948, a radical Hindu nationalist who did not want to see the partition murdered Gandhi. Here we see him at his funeral. The new prime minister, I'm going to see if I can get his first name here, Jawaharlal Nehru, becomes the prime minister of India. He was very good friends with Gandhi. There's a photograph of them together. And there he is on the right. He will become the new prime minister, and he will do a very good job with India. During the 1950s Cold War, both countries, India and Pakistan, allied themselves with the West, and both become members of the British Commonwealth. voluntary cooperation of former British colonies. This is the British Commonwealth. This is what it is. It's a voluntary cooperation of former British colonies that already contained Canada, with Australia, and New Zealand. These were British colonies that also got their independence. Here we see the Commonwealth. It's in all the continents. It actually has 54 members, and of course they're led by the British monarch, in this case, Queen Elizabeth II. There she is in all her jewels up there in the top. Now, Burma also received independence. Today is the modern country of Myanmar. That's in the light blue. Now we're going to talk about conflict in the Middle East. Now, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles divided the Middle East up between British and French mandates. In some parts of the Middle East, political independence went smoothly. In 1920, the countries of Syria and Lebanon broke from the French mandate, and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Transjordan, the modern country of Jordan, received independence from the British mandate, also in 1920. So we see these new countries, they very peacefully, they were allowed just to break away and become their own nations. However, things went much differently in Palestine and in Egypt. So we're going to talk about the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, Palestine has been part of the Fertile Crescent and has been inhabited since the Bronze Age. It is the birthplace of Judaism and Christianity. In the 7th century, Palestine was conquered by the Islamic Caliphate, the Muslims. In 692, they built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now in 1516, the land was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So there's Turkish rule to the end of World War I. Turkey was on the wrong side, or the Ottoman Empire, I'm sorry, was on the wrong side of the First World War, and they lost all the territories of their empire. So the British took control of the area from the Ottomans, creating the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, after World War I, Britain promised a Jewish homeland alongside the Arabs. Palestine had one time been the nation of Israel back in biblical days. Now, during and after World War II, Jewish refugees from Europe, many of them were concentration camp survivors, fled to Palestine, even though the British tried to stop them. This was a very famous ship. It looks like it's in very bad shape, and it was. And it was during the famous Exodus when Jewish survivors and Jews were trying to go back to Palestine. The idea there is they're going to create their own homeland. And here, see some pictures here, symbolically wearing their Holocaust, their concentration camp uniforms. Now, this is going to start a major conflict with Zionist Jews and the British government, who controlled Palestine. The principal goal of Zionism was to establish a homeland for the Jewish people. Now, Jewish terrorists bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. This was a very upscale hotel in Jerusalem where all the British diplomats and everyone, prime ministers, anyone who was visiting Palestine would stay in this hotel. It was a 5-star, very upscale hotel. But Zionist terrorists, among them a man by the name of Ben Gurion, bombed the hotel, killing 91 people. And after this, the British finally decided they're going to leave Palestine to the Jews in 1948. Now, so 1947, the British leave Palestine. The United Nations voted to divide Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. So it's going to be divided to 2 different areas. So on May 14th, 1948, the Jews in Palestine declare the country of Israel. Here we see the Israeli flag, and David Ben-Gurion becomes the first prime minister. Now, Jerusalem was divided as a city between Israel and the Arabs. So neither side, Israel cannot make it their capital city. So Israel makes Tel Aviv its capital city. You might remember that a couple years ago that Israel has wanted to make Jerusalem its capital city, but nobody's ever given them permission to actually do it because they know it would cause a problem with the Palestinians. President Trump gave them the approval and thumbs up, and Israel has now moved its capital city to Jerusalem. Now, the Palestinians and fellow Arabs saw Jewish independence as a betrayal of their own interest. In 1948, we have the Arab-Israeli War. 4 Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq, attack Israel, and the goal was to destroy it. Here we see the Israeli tanks. A lot of these were World War II tanks, Sherman tanks. But in the end, to the surprise of everyone who thought that the Arab nations would crush the new country of Israel, the Israeli army won and conquered more territory. Here we are, see them rising their flag up. And this really shocked the world. They really thought this was the end of Israel. How could they survive 4 countries? But they pulled it off and they held on and they won. Unfortunately, 900,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homeland. And this is going to create a persistent Palestinian refugee problem that goes on today. There were actually 4 more wars between Israel and the Arab states, but Israel always prevails. Now we're going to talk about Egypt. That's the other country in the Middle East that's going to have issues. Now, Great Britain conquered Egypt in 1882. Here we see the British Army fighting and conquering, like they did most of Africa. Now, after revolt in 1922, Britain grants Egypt its independence. It's not really full independence, but they would remain under British military control. So Egypt's going to be allowed to rule themselves, but the British military is going to stay there. Make sure things are okay. Following independence, Sultan Fuad I assumed the title King of Egypt. That's the Sultan on the left, and in the center is the Prince of Wales, Edward, who would eventually become Edward VIII. And he'd be the one that have to abdicate because he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, the divorced American wife. It's quite the scandal in 1936. Now, Egypt was a base of operations for the British against Germany and Italy during the Second World War, including the famous Battle of El Alamein that you see here. So it becomes very important that the British were there. Now, in 1952, the Arab defeat in 48 led to a nationalist revolution in Egypt. It was led by a young army officer named Gamal Nasser. He was born in 1918 and he would live to 1970. Now, Nasser and the revolutionaries drove out the pro-Western king. Fuad is gone. And in 1954, Nasser becomes president of Egypt. Now, Nasser advocates non-alignment like many other leaders. And he's actually smart enough to play off the U.S. against the Soviets. He never takes sides. He takes help from both. The United States lends him money. He uses that money and he buys weapons from the Soviets. So it's working out well for Nasser, and he's kind of playing off one against the other. Now, this is going to lead to the Suez Crisis. The Suez Canal is in Egypt. It had been built there by the French with the help of the British back in the 1800s. Now, in 1956, a couple years after he comes to power, Nasser seizes control of the Suez Canal. It's in Egypt, therefore it belongs to them. It was originally owned by this a group of foreign countries, France, Britain. They had control of it. Suddenly one day, the Egyptian army moved in and kicked everyone else out, caused quite the scandal in France and Great Britain, who were determined not to let this happen. So the British, the French, and they got the Israelis to help them attack Egypt. Now, the United States doesn't support it. Eisenhower is totally against it and tells everyone so. So the U.S. do not get involved in what they consider France and Britain's, mistake here. So Israel invades the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. Here we see some Israeli jets, and we see them destroying Egyptian tanks. These are kind of the American Sherman tanks. The French and the British planes make attacks against Egyptian airfields. Here we see the Port Said in Egypt that had been bombed by French planes. Oil tanks are on fire. The world is shocked by this. This is like blatant imperialism. And the U.S. is afraid this will push the Arab states like Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, towards the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower is very angry with the British, and he says so. He tells the Prime Minister he never should have gotten involved in this. The U.S. and the Soviets actually come together to force the British, French, and Israelis to back down, which they do. Eisenhower forces the Israelis to leave the Sinai Peninsula. He later regrets ever telling them that, but he did do, and they were forced to move out. Now, the future Prime Minister of Canada, a man named Lester B. Pearson, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his efforts in creating a UN peacekeeping force. This was the first time the UN had ever done that. So Lester Pearson gets the Nobel Prize. He's actually today very famous because his name was given to an NHL hockey award, the Lester Pearson Award. Now, Franco-American relationships between the United States and France never recovered from the Suez Crisis. It had been hurt already by Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and 2 years later with this, France and the United States would have this cold, relationship, like the friends who don't talk to each other anymore. They're still friends, but they don't talk to each other. Now, the Suez Canal shows that European powers can no longer control colonial empires. Now we're going to talk about Africa. Now, as we discussed earlier, in the 19th century, European countries rushed to colonize Africa. Obviously, the English, the British had the most. You can see all those areas kind of a reddish. But the French also had a large amount, they're kind of a light brown. But other countries like Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain had a very little part up in the very top. Belgium, you can see right in the center, the Belgian Congo. We're going to talk about that later. So the only two countries that, only two countries that were free was over here in Ethiopia and over here in Liberia. Liberia, of course, as you remember from U.S. history, was colonized by African slaves that had been enslaved in America and were sent back to Africa to create their own country, which they named Liberia after liberty, and they even named the capital city Monrovia after President James Monroe. So these are the only two free areas in Africa. Everything else was colonized. Now, some of the things we're going to be talking about here is, remember, we have, Algeria up here. It's important. We're going to talk about Egypt. We're going to talk about the Congo. So these areas are of particular importance. Down here, South Africa. So these are the countries we're really going to kind of focus on in this section. All right, let me just get these out of here so I can move on. Okay. Now, after World War II, obviously after World War I, I was just going to say that the German territories of German East Africa and Southwest Africa, you see them in light gray, and Cameroon were taken from them at the Versailles Treaty. After World War II, Libya up here in the north, that'll be taken away from Italy's control. So those two countries, Italy and Germany, losing world wars, will lose their colonies. But everyone else holds on to them. Now, after World War II, we're going to see a short 10-year period where most of Africa gained their independence. Now, the problem is the new African states will become caught up in the Cold War. Decolonization left a legacy of violence, economic decline, and political conflict in Africa. Most British African colonies achieved independence with little or no bloodshed. Countries like Nigeria, Guyana, Tanzania, all received very easily, just basically signed some documents, shook hands, and that was it. Then they joined what's known as the British Commonwealth. Now, Britain crushed a rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s, but then gave them independence, shortly after that. South Africa, that was different. South Africa was had a white dominating government, and they actually left the British Empire so they could preserve this policy of apartheid. Apartheid is a system where they actually have racist segregation laws that say that blacks can't have certain jobs, they can't vote. I mean, it's very similar to the South in a Reconstruction period, where blacks were citizens but had no real rights. And this is the thing of apartheid. It actually went on, let's see, when did it end? I remember growing up with it. There it is. And it was actually existed in South Africa. Let's see, does it tell you one here? It's so hard to find these things. Into the 1990s. There were protests against it, international boycotts. Eventually was ended when the white government realized they really couldn't keep it going under the enormous protests by the international community. They stepped down. One of the dissidents who had been arrested and kept in jail, Nelson Mandela, had been released, and he will then go on to become the first black president of South Africa. But that's in the 1990s. So we're talking back in the 1950s here. So. All right, now we're going to talk about the Congo. We mentioned it before. It's this very large colony right here in the middle of Africa. The Congo had become a colony of Belgium back in 1885. The Belgian had been terrible there. I think I mentioned this once before, King Leopold. There were horrible genocides of the Congolese people. The Belgians treated them terribly. Now, decolonization of the Belgian Congo will become a tragedy. I don't think there's any country in Africa that has had a sadder 150 years history than the Congo. Belgium doesn't want to give up its colony. Remember, Belgium is a small country in Europe, famous for its waffles and Godiva chocolate. And it's not a very big country, so the idea they have a country that's in Africa, a colony in Africa that is huge, so many times bigger than Belgium was itself, was a little thing of pride for them. So they didn't want to give it up for that reason. Plus, Belgium made a lot of money off the Congo, a lot of people in Belgium, and they wanted to keep the apartheid system there to exploit the country's resources. But it causes a lot of tension with the Congolese people. Now, an anti-colonial movement started under Patrice Lumumba. There he is. You see his picture there. He's going to negotiate with the Belgians. He wants them to leave and then to give them their freedom. Now, eventually Belgium decides to agree to this. So in 1960, they say, yes, we will pull out. They give a very short timeline. They tell this, on this date, you are in charge. Lumumba will become the prime minister. But it's a very short period, not much time for him to get everything really all organized and prepared. So when the day comes and they pull out, it becomes a disaster. Things aren't working. There's still Belgian military soldiers there. There's attacks against them. Things look very bad. All right. Lumbumba and his government can't handle the problems going on there. Now, one of the problems is that, at the time, the United States was concerned about the Congo. Now, Lumbumba, like many other leaders, decided not to join sides. We're not going to join either the West or the East. We're going to be, in between, not take sides. Lumbumba does not like communism. He equates it with colonialism that has been so bad for Africa. But he stays in between them, and he needs help. So he turns to the Soviet Union for help. Now the CIA starts thinking that Lumumba is just a new Fidel Castro, and then he's going to turn the Congo into a communist country and align with the Soviet Union. So the CIA decides they're not going to let that happen, and they're going to get rid of Lumumba. So they organize a military coup with some Belgian officers, some Congolese military officers, and they actually overthrow Lumumba. He's arrested. He's moved from a couple prison camps. Then one day in January of 1961, him and two of his associates are taken out, and they're shot by firing squad, which of course is shocking to the world when the word gets out. He was greatly praised by a lot of people. There's now, of course, when it comes out, there are streets in like Warsaw, Poland. There's a square in Belgium named after him. Malcolm X said that he was the greatest black man ever to walk on the African continent. So he's had a lot of, Lumbumba's had a lot of praise now for people realizing what a great person he really was. But at the time, it didn't work out well for him. The United States actually backed a dictator general in the Congolese army named Joseph Mobutu in this coup. He eventually gains control of the Congo. He's not a really nice guy. He will rule until, believe it or not, 1997. And he's going to become very rich, very powerful, while the Congo remained one of the poorest and violent countries in Africa. Eventually, they're going to get rid of him. It got so bad there was actually genocide between different tribes within the Congo killing each other. And he was having one killing another tribe that other countries like Rwanda and Uganda, later helped by Angola and Burundi, decide to actually go into the Congo to get rid of him. He had gone to Switzerland. He had prostate cancer. Eventually, this became known as the First Congo War. And he was eventually kicked out of power. He ended up in, I think it was Morocco, where he eventually died of cancer. In, forget what year it was, but it wasn't shortly after 1997. So anyway, he was really one of the bad persons in Africa who exploited the country just as bad as any of the white colonists did. No, he's gone now. Now we're going to talk about Algeria. Algeria is a French colony. Let me just show you. It's a very big one. Here it is, all the way up here. All right. Algeria is in North Africa, along with Tunisia and Morocco as their North African colonies. They have a lot: French West Africa, Equatorial Africa, a lot of colonies in Africa the French control. France itself, I can't show you on the map here, but it's right across the Mediterranean Sea, somewhere, I should say directly north of Algeria, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so let me get rid of these things here. There we go. Now, the French invaded in 1830 and started a war that would last till 1872. And in those 42 years, the war will kill approximately 825,000 Algerians. Now, during World War II, Algeria becomes part of Vichy France, along with Tunisia and Morocco. And, they are on the side of Germany, but of course, when the invasions come, they just switch sides, which really pissed off Hitler. Now, after the war, many of Africa's French colonies were given their independence. Basically, a little ceremony, shake some hands, sign some papers, thank you, au revoir. But they didn't totally leave. They kind of stayed in a sort of French Commonwealth, where they still had the French culture, French influence, but they still were free, but, that was the system. So it was okay. They didn't mind. Algeria is different. See, the problem with Algeria is many French citizens had moved there. It's on the Mediterranean coast, beautiful country, warm climate. I mean, the northern part's fine. If you go further south, you're in the Sahara Desert. But it's they grow food there, and these people, they were nicknamed the Pieds Noirs. Pieds Noirs in French means Blackfeet. These were French citizens that lived in Africa, in French Africa, Algeria. They were from other countries too, but mostly the French, obviously. They had total control of the government and society. They controlled everything. They were in charge, military, the economics, banking, government, justice, courts. Everything was in charge by the Pieds Noirs. Now, many of their families had lived there for generations, fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. Even the Algerian Jews who lived there were considered Pieds Noirs, and they were as indigenous as the Algerian Muslim population. So they had been there for a long time. And the indigenous Muslim population were pretty much treated like second-class citizens. So they're not happy about that. So while other countries are given their freedom to go their merry way, Algeria is not. Now, some of the Algerians, these Muslim fundamentalists, communists, these decide to rebel. So these rebels form what is called the National Liberation Front, or FLN. Of course, it's in French, so that's why the initials don't match up with the words. That's their logo there. And in the 1950s, they revolted against French rule. This is going to lead to the Algerian War. Now, in 1954, pressured by the Pieds Noirs, the French sent, believe it or not, 400,000 soldiers to Algeria to crush the FLN and end the rebellion. And this is going to start an 8-year war known as, the Algerian War. Now, both sides commit terrible atrocities over those 8 years. The FLN repeatedly attacked Pieds Noir civilians in savage terrorist attacks. The French army used torture, mass detentions to try to defeat the FLN. And they actually were doing it. They were actually winning this war, but their methods were so bad and the excessive force was so horrible, they actually caused more Muslims to join the FLN. And on top of that, it caused French public opinion went against them. There was international outrage, which pressured the French government to say, you know what, we got to stop this. So they're going to end the conflict. So the French government decides to end it. Not so fast. Not going to be that easy. Now, so they start peace talks with the FLN, and suddenly there's a revolt in the French army. The Pieds Noirs are not happy. And there's actually a threat of a coup d'etat, not just in Algeria, but to spread to Paris, maybe take over the French government. Now, it's happened before, as we've seen in this course. Now, in 1958, to solve the problem, the popular French leader, Charles de Gaulle, is reinstated as the prime minister to keep Algeria in French control. This was the way they're going to make, he's the leader, the hero of France, leader of the Free French during World War II. He became president of France afterwards. He was the most beloved hero in French, in all of France. So they're going to bring him back. He's a little bit older now, but they're going to bring him back. So he's going to keep control of Algeria. This makes the Pieds Noirs and the French army, the military officers, very happy. We have de Gaulle. De Gaulle is very tough. There's no doubt about it. But he's also smart. He realizes that Algeria is just dragging France down. He realizes they have to cut it loose. So de Gaulle shocks everyone when he moved to make peace and give Algeria its freedom. He knew he had to. It was just causing too many problems, not just in France, but throughout the world. Now, in 1961, the furious Pieds Noirs and a lot of the military leaders in the French army formed a secret organization called the OAS. Their plan was to mount an attempted takeover of Algeria and possibly the French government in Paris. Luckily for de Gaulle and the French government, there were military officers in the French army who may not have been happy with de Gaulle and may have thought this was really bad, but they were not going to become traitors to their own government. So they stayed loyal, and that eventually ended this attempted takeover. And in 1962, the following year, Algeria gains its independence. This was one of the real controversial periods in French history, this whole thing with Algeria. Now, of course, after the independence is given, over 1 million Pieds Noirs fled Algeria. Most to France, some to the United States, but they got out because they knew things would not be pretty for them. So by the mid-1960s, most African countries had won their independence. Most were peaceful, but some through bloody revolutions. So most of the countries of Africa were free. By the way, I meant to mention before that the Congo, when the Mobutu was in charge, he renamed it Zaire, but it's since been renamed back to the Republic of the Congo. I just forgot to mention that because when I was growing up, it was always Zaire. Anyway, so everyone pretty much is, getting some freedom back in the late 60s. But there was one European country that wanted to hold on to its empire. Strangely enough, little Portugal. Portugal was the exception. It waged wars against independence movements in Angola and Mozambique into the 1970s. So we see here's Angola, and here is Mozambique. All right, they're kind of in the southern part of Africa, and one on the west coast, Angola, one on the east coast, and Portugal wants to hold on to them. They don't want to let go. All right, let me get these. So, even after decolonization, most European powers kept economic domination over former African colonies. There was no military, no government control, but there was a lot of economic control there. This has been criticized by many people as a new system of neo-colonialism, new colonialism, where there's no military or governmental control, but we're going to control the finances and, keep you under our, domination. Well, that's, an argument that goes on today. Anyway, that's it. We're finished with the Cold War, and sadly, we're finished with AP Euro. I hope you learned something about some of the stuff that goes on in the world today through this today's activity. But I really do hope you learned something this year from AP Euro. I really enjoyed teaching it. You were a wonderful class, as I told you earlier in our Zoom meeting, and I'm going to miss you. Hopefully, we have an AP Euro class next year. Hopefully, enough students want to take it. I'm hoping to keep my fingers crossed. Anyway, thank you very much again for everything you did this year, and I appreciate it. And enjoy your weekend. This is not due to Monday, so hopefully I'll see some of you at a NHS courting ceremony sometime in the future. All right? Anyway, take care and goodbye.